Okay, hello, my friends. So I think I've gotten the audio sorted out. I had duplicating, and then I had a duplicating a third time when you heard the underwater echo. Here is this week's recap. So what I'm going to do is go from last Friday to yesterday. Today is Saturday as I'm recording this, and just go over the headlines that I've gone over, and then just give you a little commentary on that. So last Friday, Zelensky was very busy. He was at the G7. He was flown over China and India. So he got permission on a French jet to fly over China and India to get to the G7 conference, which I think is really telling. Hungary was threatening to hold up Ukraine weapons aid. They keep doing that kind of thing. The U.S. is now going to back F-16s, the transfer of F-16s to Ukraine. Now, it'll take at least 4 months, according to U.S. government documents, for them to be able to train up on F-16s, but that beats a year or something like that. Prigozhin, there was a great article. Actually, somebody informed me, and tell me if this is incorrect, but I should say Prigozhin, and that's the Ukrainian pronunciation. I'm sorry. The Ukrainian pronunciation is a H instead of a G. By the way, my pronunciation is shot. Even in the United States, my pronunciation is terrible. So, anyway, Preclusion, a special military operation within the special operation. And I did a video on this past week, and I think it's right that I did 2 videos on it, actually 3. One was about this article, and then the other 2 were about Prigozhin's comments. Russia orders arrest for the ICC prosecutor for making false accusations of guilt. So the ICC put arrest warrant on Putin, and Putin put an arrest warrant on the ICC prosecutor for knowingly putting a warrant out for somebody who's innocent. You can't make this stuff up. Russian sanctions the U.S. in retaliation for sanctions on them, and that includes President Obama, who will not be able to travel to Russia, and he is apparently deeply disappointed. Okay, so that's it for Friday. Saturday, the Russia looks weak after Kinzhal attacks failed. So the Kinzhal missiles were supposed to be invulnerable, and you go back a couple months, and Putin was saying no one can stop our hypersonic missiles, and well, apparently they can. Zelensky was to meet with Biden at the G7. Lavrov said that the G7 was to contain Russia. Now, he knew what he was doing with using that language of containing, because that was language from the Soviet era. Prigozhin, Wagner totally took Bakhmut, he claims, and Kyiv still denies it, but most of the territory is gone. And they've taken some on the outskirts, and they've have a few buildings left at this point, but it's pretty much gone at this point. Sunday, May 21st, RT says inside the Bakhmut meat grinder, and they have this article about it, how they just drew in these Ukrainians, and it's like what Russian state media, Freudian slip, I said what Russian state mirror. What Russian state media does is they kind of mirror what their opponents are doing. So it was actually a meat grinder for the Russians, but they're talking about how they just drew these Ukrainians in and just destroyed them. And you'll hear it parroted by Scott Ritter and Douglas McGregor. It's absolutely baffling that they rely on these kinds of sources. Putin congratulates the military for their glorious victory there, and Zelensky compares Bakhmut to total destruction in Hiroshima, and that's while he was in Hiroshima talking to the G7. Okay, Monday, May 22nd, the situation in Bakhmut, there's still a little bit of small defense. The Ukrainians maintain that Bakhmut was a good thing because it was a trap, it sucked in a lot of Russians, killed a lot of Russians. Yeah, I mean, it held the Russians in place for a long time. Zelensky apparently dominated the G7 summit. This was the primary focal point of the G7. By the way, the G7 used to be the G8, and Russia was expelled after 2014. Russia says that F-16 transfer raises the NATO question. Like, oh, again, every time that Russia tries to saber rattle, it's like the boy that cried wolf. The report that Zaluzny, I can't pronounce it. Zaluzny is dead or seriously wounded came out, and this has been out for a little while now. But there's multiple reports. I did a video on this yesterday, so go back and watch that. NATO Parliamentary Assembly recognized Russia's crimes against Ukraine as genocide, and country after country is starting to do this. NATO Assembly did this, and then just yesterday, the British House of Commons did. Russian deputy minister dies suddenly after slamming a fascist invasion. It's a little sketchy, and there's dozens. I showed this in another video, like 3 dozen oligarchs, businessmen, something along those lines in Russia have died under mysterious circumstances since the beginning of the war. So you got to be careful what you say if you're an oligarch in Russia. Russia reacts, this is Tuesday, Russia reacts to the Belgorod invasion. Absolutely amazing. Cross-border, Russians crossing the border, ethnic Russians crossing the border into Russia to carry out this raid. Ukraine court, and I'll talk about this more in just a little bit, but Ukraine courts Africa in the global south. Not court like judicial, but they're like trying to woo them. And that's smart because Russia has been doing this for a long time. The ICC wants to arrest Putin, but others need to play their part, said one particular editorial. South Africa, for example, told Putin do not attend the BRICS summit, and they said don't attend the BRICS summit because you could be arrested. There's an ICC order for your arrest. Don't come here. Von der Leyen called for a dedicated tribunal, so they might get some traction. I personally don't want to see Putin in the ICC. I want to see him stand trial in Kyiv. I think that would be a more powerful statement. Belgorod mayor, or Belgorod is how I'm supposed to say this. Viewers corrected me. Belgorod mayor tells residents not to return yet. I showed that video in a clip. Fighting appears to have ended in Belgorod. Pravda claims that Russian forces annihilated more than 70 fighters, but what we found out later in the week was that apparently none of them were killed, even though they staged Russia staged U.S. vehicles used in the raid. They planted them to look like they were all shot up and ran into a ditch or something along those lines. It's all smoke and mirrors. Zelensky meets with Marines on the front line, and I mean, you got to contrast Zelensky meeting regularly with his soldiers on the front line and Putin's staged attempt hundreds of kilometers away from the front line. It's just, it's remarkable to watch. And they keep doing this kind of thing like we're stupid. Here's another stupid thing. Putin discounts Ukraine with a 17th century map from France and saying, see, Ukraine was never there. Well, it actually had Ukraine listed on it, and some smart viewers have pointed that out. Okay, Wednesday, the 24th of May, it was day 455, 400-year-old map. Again, the same story came out. So Putin did the map thing, and then the next day, people were like, it's right here, and they circled it where it said Ukraine in French, but he wasn't reading French. Belgorod will stretch Russia's defensive line, and this is the real beauty of the Belgorod raid, right? It was showing that Russia's weak and they're not paying attention. Like if you're at war with another country right on your border, wouldn't you want to have some defense lines? They didn't have the defense lines, so now they're going to have to stretch defense lines all the way to Belarus. So there's that. Prigozhin's rant warns of revolution, and it's carried in the papers all wrong. Like, he said these things, factually correct, but the reason that he said these things, I went into in a different video, or actually 2 videos this week, and I think he's Putin's mouthpiece. Now, I'm not saying that Putin is sending him a memo saying, hey, say this or say that, but they're on the same page, and as long as he's doing Putin's bidding, he's safe. So he can say whatever he wants and be nutty as he wants and build up Wagner however he wants, as long as he's saying what Putin wants him to say, which is slapping at his military. Or in the second video is even more important, slapping at the oligarchs for allowing their children to go and shake their booty over in United Arab Emirates or whatever. Okay, you just got to watch the video. Meeting of Eurasia Economic Council, kind of a snoozer, but at least Russia's realizing they have to be involved in Eurasia, where China was starting to take over their area. 28 ships blocked from entering the Pevindi port near Odessa, violating the grain treaty. That didn't get a lot of play in the media, but it happened, and you need to be aware of it. Okay, Thursday on the 25th of May, Wagner is transferring control of Bakhmut to the Russian army, and we'll see how that goes. Because if they, if the Ukrainians do recapture big parts of Wagner after the big parts of Bakhmut after the Russian army takes over from Wagner, then Wagner can say, "See, we did all this and they lost it." Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. The invasion has fueled funding for clean energy, and it really has. Clean energy has now outstripped funding for fossil fuels for the first time, as I understand it. Zelensky gave a commencement address by video at Johns Hopkins. And you're thinking, well, why is he doing that? He's just feathering his cap. Well, he's now Dr. Zelensky, but that's not the issue. The issue is he keeps himself relevant by doing those kinds of things. Like, people criticized him for the Vogue magazine cover, but even criticizing him for the Vogue magazine cover kept the conversation about Ukraine relevant. And I think Zelensky's just absolutely genius in the way that he deals with media. Russia and Belarus have signed an agreement transferring nuclear weapons. Russia still controls those nuclear weapons, but they're on the ground in Belarus. So, I mean, I don't know what he really benefited from those. From doing that, but it's more of that same nuclear saber rattling. Okay, Friday, this is yesterday, the 26th of May, West tries to find a new model for Ukrainian security. They called it the porcupine model. And this was, quote, providing Ukraine with even more training and weaponry could make the country even more prickly like a porcupine, making it less likely that an aggressor is going to want to keep attacking it. And so there's something to that, but they still need NATO membership. One of my bright viewers pointed out, and this was actually really good. They pointed out that it was Germany and France in 2008 that denied Ukraine its membership, or were the forces pushing back against it. So they're really kind of to blame, and it's not like they could see what was going to happen in 2022. So they're not to blame in that sense. Like, they knew that this would happen, but they're the ones that blocked it. And this war would not be happening at all if Ukraine was part of NATO. So Ukraine will be part of NATO before long. As soon as the war is over, Ukraine will join NATO. The U.S. may provide ATACMS, and they're considering that, like really considering that, because the UK broke that gate with the Storm Shadow. So now what's the harm in providing ATACMS? Russia is selling Zelensky's Crimean penthouse apartment. So Zelensky had wealth because he was an actor who made lots of money before he became president. And so he had an apartment in Crimea. Russia's selling it and paying off the wounded soldiers with that money, and it's going to their families and whatever. Sure, it's probably going to an oligarch's pocket. Russia is to punish those who fled Russia during martial law, and that was a really interesting one as well. So by the way, I just saw this. The Russian dude just got his digital summons to come join the Russian army. So they're still quietly mobilizing. They haven't given up at all. Russia strikes a medical facility in central Ukraine, keeping it classy as always. And Boris Johnson met with Trump to discuss Ukraine. Now, they didn't talk about the details of that, but I'm sure that Boris is all in trying to convince Trump, look, you got to be behind Ukraine. I think if Trump shifted gears and full-throatedly got behind Ukraine, and I don't know this, but this is my gut, he would easily lock up the Republican nomination, because there's so many of us. I'm conservative, and there's so many of us going, we couldn't do that again. But Ukraine is really the thing that's pushed a lot of conservatives away from Trump, and yeah, I think he could lock up the nomination. I don't think he could win. No, he's defied gravity before, but I think he could win the Republican primary, but I think he would lose the general election. Okay, that's all that I have for this week's quick overview, weekly recap. Thanks for listening to me. Hope that helps you understand and process. Thank you for caring about Ukraine.